Hey y'all, this is Brown at IF Brown, and today we've got a bit of a double feature on our hands, namely Missing in Action 1 and 2 on DVD. So this is unfortunately a bare bones release, but at the very least you have both movies in one place. So you've got Missing in Action 1 on one disc and Missing in Action 2 on another disc. So as far as Chuck Norris's filmography is concerned, Missing in Action 1 and 2 are oftentimes considered essential films of his. So, if you're a Chuck Norris fan, or if you're a fan of, 80s action movies, or, B movies from the 80s, or B movie, or B action movies, or if you're wanting to have some idea of why Chuck Norris is oftentimes jokingly referred to as a mimetic badass. You got the Chuck Norris facts and all that stuff. A lot of that comes from these two movies, but along with the rest of his work. So I'm not going to say that these are good movies, but they do have moments in them that at least make them worth watching. At the very least, once or twice. Because I mean, you have some legitimately badass Chuck Norris moments, and you also have some good villains here and there. And every movie needs a good villain, right? But Missing in Action 1 and 2 were both released by the Cannon Group, and the Cannon Group, in turn, was the film production company that was run by Israeli cousins Menahem Golan and Yoram Globus. And both of those guys, loved movies, and they loved to make movies. And so when they, put the Cannon Group together, they basically churned out a lot of B movies. Now, sometimes, some of their releases, were, successes at the box office, but one of the problems that they had was that they didn't quite know how to capitalize on the success of some of their movies. Like, for example, if you have, say, Break-In, which is about breakdancing, or Revenge of the Ninja, which obviously is about ninjas, they didn't quite know how to follow up those films. Like, they just saw that they were successes at the box office, and then they would basically throw out another film or two with very similar subject matter, but with that understanding why those films were as successful as they were, at least as far as the box office is concerned. But in regards to, say, their relationship with Chuck Norris, they would end up working with Chuck Norris on at least 5 films, including Missing in Actions 1 and 2. You also have the films Hero and the Terror, you have Firewalker, and you also have Delta Force. And so Chuck Norris definitely had a good working relationship with the Cannon Group. Now, whether or not those movies were objectively good is a different story, but they were some of the Cannon Group's more financially successful, or as well as Chuck Norris's financially successful as well. But one of the things that kind of stands out about these movies is that you can tell that Chuck Norris is making an effort as far as acting goes in these movies. Now, you're not going to mistake it for high art or award-winning acting by any means, but while he is kind of a badass in these movies, he is making an effort to I guess you could say give his characters some form of depth and substance. And a big part of that is, I believe, because he had a younger brother who was sadly killed in the Vietnam War. And so years later, after long after all 3 of the Missing in Action movies had been made, because there was a third one, but it hadn't been released by the Cannon Group. Chuck Norris basically said that he did those 3 movies as kind of a tribute to, his younger brother who sadly died in Vietnam. So that could definitely go a long way to explaining, why, even though the movies themselves are kind of subpar, Chuck Norris himself is actually better than one expects, at certain points in, both movies. And so, not award-winning acting, but you could definitely tell he's trying. So he's not just like a, one-man army who, is never injured or anything like that. Like, he's definitely got some trauma, that kind of thing. So I did appreciate that about the movies in that respect. But another reason that the movie, is, kind of, fascinating, at least from a meta standpoint, is that, even though it came out in 1984 and was released, 1 year before Rambo First Blood Part 2, many people regard it as a ripoff of First Blood Part 2. And a lot of that stems from James Cameron having, written a treatment for the screenplay for First Blood Part 2 back in 1983. And so the story goes that someone at the Cannon Group somehow got a hold of a copy of that particular treatment that James Cameron had written. And so, they thought, hey, this has some potential here. And so they also, were really wanting to work with Chuck Norris too. And so they basically redid, the same story, but just changed some stuff up to where, you have a lot of similarities. You have, a Vietnam vet, going back to Vietnam to, initially prove the existence of American POWs, being held, in prisoner long after the Vietnam War had ended, and also kicking ass, taking names, and rescuing them as a one-man army, that kind of thing. So, but they changed some stuff up enough to where it's like, if the people who were making First Blood Part 2 were wanting to take legal action against, the people making Missing in Action, their asses were covered, just legally speaking. But at the same time, you watch both movies and you could definitely tell that, hey, these two are a little too similar at times, that kind of thing. They're different, but there are enough similarities to where you're kind of like, so, I don't know, just personal opinion. I'll admit it's been a while since I've seen First Blood Part 2, but from what I remember of it, I would argue that First Blood Part 2 was objectively better than Missing in Action 1 and 2, but I'm not going to say it's a good movie, though. It's like cartoonishly entertaining, but if you compare it to, say, the original First Blood, First Blood was a masterpiece. The original, our introduction to John Rambo, that was a great movie. But, First Blood Part 2, while it was better than Missing in Action 1 and 2, from what I remember of it, it was just, it had some cool moments, but, you didn't go away, haunted, by what you saw, like, say, you did with First Blood. That ending, monologue that he gave about his, friend dying in Vietnam. Shit, I still, think about that. So yeah, that's where, some of the, behind the scenes controversy, comes from, in regards to, say, Missing in Action, and being accused of ripping off First Blood Part 2. But another reason why it's kind of controversial is because, as, First Blood Part 2 did, Missing in Action was, grappling with, some hot topic subject matter, namely, the subject of American, POWs who were still being held in Vietnam long after the Vietnam War ended. And this was something that, was a hot button issue, especially in the 80s. And, American politicians were, getting involved and, trying to, say, hey, what's going on here? Like, they're trying to work with the Vietnamese government, say, hey, is this true? And so there was a lot of back and forth, and you know, it's one of those things that, I haven't done enough research on it to know like as much as I would like to know in order to like say make an accurate say video about it or something like that. But I will say though that, I mean, much like any side in war oftentimes did, I mean, the Vietnamese government did hold American POWs, because I mean it was war. And I mean the American government, I mean, we did the same, multiple times, throughout history, like in World War II especially. I mean, just look at the Japanese internment camps where we put Japanese American citizens, and so no side's really clean in all this. So I'm not going to sit there and say that that there weren't American POWs in Vietnam. I mean, John McCain, former, I mean, he was a a late American politician. He was a Vietnam veteran, and if I remember correctly, he was held in a POW camp for 5 years. And so, yeah, I mean, there was definitely grounds to, bring up, I mean, to give serious consideration to the possibility that some American troops were still being held in Vietnam, after the war had ended, because there were also a lot of people that were still missing. They didn't know if they were alive or dead. And so as time has gone on though, it's something that at least as far as the mainstream media is concerned, and as far as a lot of people are concerned, the issue's kind of been put to rest, because they kind of, just kind of came to the conclusion that they weren't, being held, there, after the Vietnam War had ended. It's just, there were a lot of people that had gone missing, for various reasons. And, some arguments held that, like a lot of the fighter pilots that, were listed as missing action, it very well may have been, shot down and their bodies too, badly, burned to be, recognized or something like that. Or, maybe, there were American troops that had been killed in battle, but, maybe their bodies had just been, destroyed to such a degree that they were unrecognizable, just things like that. So, honestly, it's kind of a bit above my pay grade, but I will say that it was, a hot button issue, especially back in the 80s. And so, and a lot of people honestly, believed that American POWs were still being held in Vietnam after the Vietnam War had ended. And so, while you have movies like Missing in Action and Rambo First Blood Part 2, trying to sort of this, go for the whole, let's go back and win the Vietnam War in style approach. I had a hard time, for the most part, taking the films seriously. But I will say though that, if there's one movie that I could think of that actually did a decent job of it, it would be this movie called Uncommon Valor with Gene Hackman. And it's one of those things where whether or not you believe in the idea that American POWs were still being held in Vietnam, I mean, objectively speaking, it was a well done movie with characters that we came to care about. And so when the action happened, we cared about what was going on. And so but anyway, in regards to Missing in Action, I mean, that was another reason why it was a bit controversial when it came out. But it did do well at the box office though, and it made somewhere between $22 and $23 million on a budget that was somewhere between $2 and $4 million. So critically it did not do well, but as far as the box office was concerned, it was definitely a hit for both the Cannon Group and for Chuck Norris. So But yeah, let's. Before I get into the review, there is one other thing about some of the behind the scenes stuff. So even though Missing in Action came out in 1984, it was actually supposed to be the second movie in the series because they filmed Missing in Action 1 and 2 back to back, but Missing in Action 2 was actually supposed to be the first movie. And what we know as Missing in Action, as in the original Missing in Action, was supposed to be the second movie. But apparently, the people who were, in charge of the movies, were looking at them, and they were of the opinion that Missing in Action 2 was the better movie. And so they decided to release it first. And so, Missing in Action, which came out in 1984, was actually supposed to be Missing in Action 2. So, but instead they, changed it around. And so what we ended up having is Missing in Action 2, the beginning, which, serves as kind of a, prequel sequel. And so, but yeah, that was a lot of the, I guess you could say, behind the scenes stuff that one might want to know going in before watching the movie, or at the very least is of interest, for someone wanting to check the movie out. So, okay, let's go ahead and get into the movies. So, the first Missing in Action, it takes place 1984, and Chuck Norris plays a guy named, Colonel James Braddock, who had been held in Vietnam for, I believe it was 7 years. But he, ended up escaping from this POW camp, and that was apparently 10 years ago, and so he's grappling with PTSD, and he's still haunted by nightmares and memories of his time at the POW camp that he was stuck at, but he's actually being asked by some people in Washington, to, go on this fact-finding mission, which would involve him going along with, a couple of, people from Washington, to Vietnam to, verify whether or not American POWs were still being held prisoner, after the Vietnam War had ended. And so initially that's all he's supposed to do. But, once he sets foot, back in Vietnam, he's making it clear that, while he is going to, go along with the mission and everything, he's not going to play nice with the local politicians. And so he, in fact, sneaks into, the room of, let's see, give me a sec, I find his name, a guy named General Tran, who's a Vietnamese military official, and, he actually holds him at knife point in his bedroom, and, basically, demands to know, where, the camp is that the American POWs are being held at. And so, General Tran, tries to, initially say, hey, I don't know what you're talking about. But then, after, the knife is pressed a little further into, his neck here, he basically admits that, yes, the camp does exist. And he gives him a rough idea of, where it is, but not exactly being the sharpest tool in the shed, at least in regards to, say, surviving a face-off with Chuck Norris. He makes the mistake of going for a gun underneath his pillow, and in self-defense, Chuck Norris kills him, and he's able to make it back to his hotel room and pretend that he was with this sexy Washington liaison, and he was pretending like he was getting it on with her. And so when the Vietnamese security forces bust into their room, they're kind of like, and let me guess, you were here the whole, let's guess, you were here the whole time, right? And so they can't really prove anything, but they, threaten, Braddock, and say that, tomorrow you leave, or you will not, leave here alive afterwards. And so after that, Braddock, he leaves town, but he makes a point to, sort of, stick to the ground and, and look up an old buddy of his, a war buddy, by the name of Tuck, who, apparently served with him in Vietnam at some point. And, the two, he finds him at this Vietnamese brothel / dive bar. And, Tuck has, basically been kind of like an American expat over there for, several years. And he's got a line on the black market weapons trade. But Braddock looks him up and says, hey, I'm going to be, looking up the camp where the American POWs are being held at, and I need your help. And so, Tuck says, hey, look, I don't want to go back over there, as in, literally, where, they fought and everything, but he says, I'll get you to, the place, by boat. And so, the two of them, they got this boat and they head on over there. And it wouldn't be a Chuck Norris movie if, things went smoothly. So things do not go smoothly. And, they end up, being attacked by Vietnamese forces. And so, needless to say, Chuck Norris, Braddock does, end up, finding proof that, American POWs are being held in, prison camps. And so, from there, his whole objective changes from, proving their existence to, okay, let's go back and rescue them. So, and so then we go into the second movie, and this is where things get a little confusing because, the second movie is supposed to be a prequel to the first movie, and, showing, more or less exactly what happened in Braddock's time in the Vietnamese POW camp. And so the problem is, the events in that movie don't exactly, line up with what was shown in the first movie. Not only just, what we see happening, but also just in terms of, say, chronology, because, when, on one hand, the first movie, said that, he had been held prisoner there for 7 years until he escaped. But then the second movie, has it to where he's been being held there and it's been 10 years. And so this goes into, say, the quote-unquote present-day 1980s, complete with, some, footage of Ronald Reagan, talking about, the issue at hand of American POWs, possibly being held in, Vietnam after the Vietnam War had ended. But then, of course, it goes back to movie mode when we see Braddock, with a handful of, of fellow surviving soldiers in a POW camp, and they're also, South Vietnamese, soldiers being held prisoner with them as well, and they're at the quote unquote mercy of a guy named Colonel Yin, who's played with evil enthusiasm by the actor Soon-Tek, who was a really good actor. But anyway, Colonel Yin is a very sadistic piece of shit, and he delights in torturing the POWs, both physically and psychologically, and he has a personal enmity with Braddock because he sees Braddock as the leader, and so he's constantly trying to find ways to break him down. And for the record, the reason that, they're in this POW camp in the first place is because, Braddock had gone with a few other soldiers on a helicopter, for, basically just kind of, routine, field exercise. But then they ended up getting a distress call from some soldiers that had been pinned down, and so they were the only ones in the area. And so they went in to try and rescue them, but unfortunately, while they were able to get some of the soldiers on board the helicopter, the copter had been shot down by Vietnamese fire. And so that's how Braddock ended up, and the surviving soldiers ended up being held prisoner in this POW camp. And so so Yin and his people, they've made a point to basically deny that the Vietnam War is over, in the sense of their interactions with the prisoners. And so while Braddock and some of the others are of the belief that the war has been over for some time, they don't exactly have proof of it, because of how they are being held prisoner and how they're very restricted in terms of, say, the information they're able to get. And so Yin just, keeps on, taunting them, saying that, the war has not ended, and that, basically, the people that, cared about them, have moved on with their lives. And so, basically, like I said, really sadistic guy who tortures them, physically and psychologically. And so Braddock, I mean, he does his best to, hold his men together, but it's clear that, it's only a matter of time before, someone breaks, or, they can only hold out for so long. And unfortunately, after a significant amount of torture, combined with the fact that one of the American POWs has a really bad case of malaria, Braddock agrees to give in to Yin and give him what he wants. Namely, Yin this whole time has been wanting Braddock to confess to his war crimes against the Vietnamese people. And of course, Braddock, he sees it for the bullshit that he is, because, he never went after the Vietnamese people. He just, fought in combat, but, Yin is wanting him to be, shown as, a criminal, and basically, propaganda win against the American government. And this whole time, Braddock's been, turning it down, albeit not without some, psychological difficulty, but he's able to pull through each time. And his men are like, dude, why don't you just give in, and we'll get out of here. And he keeps telling them that if I give in, not only does Yin win, but he has no reason to keep any of you alive after that, And so, this time though, with one of his comrades, being stricken with malaria and medical supplies being withheld, Braddock agrees to confess, to the war crimes that Yin is wanting him to admit to. But unfortunately, though, right after he is photographed signing his confession, said soldier with malaria is given an overdose of opium, and is then burned alive. And it's a very it's a very brutal scene, the way they do it and everything. But that's basically the breaking point. That's where you see Braddock trying to be the guy holding everyone together, to Braddock in full-on vengeance mode. And so that's when the movie becomes one-man army action flick in the third act. So okay, that's the rundown plot-wise on both movies. And so, while I'm not going to say that they're good movies, there are things I like about them. And so, like, for example, I thought that Chuck Norris actually did a fairly decent job of portraying someone who, was going through some, war-related PTSD. And there were certain moments, especially, in the first act of the first movie, in the first Missing in Action movie, like, you see him, waking up from a nightmare, and while the nightmare itself, while the flashback itself is unfortunately kind of cheesy, because yeah, you got people dressed as American soldiers and Vietnamese soldiers, and shooting at each other and explosions and what have you, but while the explosions look cool, it's just that the choreography feels very I don't know, it feels like a stage production in terms of, like, say, a badly choreographed dance or something along those lines. But once he wakes up, though, you actually see him sort of prowling around his apartment and listening to the news about the hearings about American POWs being held in Vietnam after the war had ended. And so you could tell that that's really getting at him. But then he sees this cartoon, and it's a Spider-Man cartoon of all things. And basically a criminal escapes from prison, and Spider-Man's going after him and everything. But of course Braddock, having been a prisoner himself, he's kind of zooming in on this and really identifying with what's going on there. And I will say that I thought that was a nice touch, how something as simple as a child's cartoon could rattle him that much. And so in those moments, I actually thought Chuck Norris did a pretty good job. And also, you've probably seen it on say in memes or something like that, but it's this is the one where he kicks over the TV in his apartment. That's where that meme comes from. So but in context, it actually makes sense. And then he calls up the people in Washington, tells them that he'll go along with the mission. And so in moments like that, I actually thought that Chuck Norris did a fairly decent job. Or like when he's when he's interacting with, say, the guy General Tran, who was played by the wonderful James Hong. Whenever the two of them interact, it's actually pretty neat to see, because James Hong is, yeah, I just want to make sure I was saying his name right. But James Hong, he was the bad guy in Big Trouble in Little China, and he was in that movie that came out recently, Everything Everywhere All at Once. He was the grandfather in that. Great actor. And here, he's playing this Vietnamese general, who on the surface, is, I guess you could say, on the political side of things, is supposedly a good guy, but he keeps taunting Braddock, but he's doing so in a way to where his tone of voice is the tone is conversational, but the words are cutting, and so basically trying to push Braddock's buttons. And so the way Chuck Norris plays it, he plays Braddock as obviously a traumatized individual, but a very blunt individual. So basically someone who's not going to play games. And there's this point I remember where Tran is asking Braddock about the $5,000 bounty being placed on your head. And he said, "Is it true that bounty was placed on your head for the fact that you killed civilians?" And one of the things, what ends up happening is Braddock says that it was a little higher than that, or actually I think he said it was a lot higher than that. And he says, by the way, it wasn't for killing civilians, it was for killing assholes like you. And say what you will about Chuck Norris as an actor, but in that moment, the bluntness and just the intensity with which he's focused on Tran is kind of like, damn. He got some balls, or his character has some balls, and I thought that Chuck Norris did a good job selling, that type of attitude, So he does do well in moments like that, though. But throughout the rest of the movie, though, this is where the movie, I feel like, falters, because the pacing, after the first that bit in the first act, you know, and I would say, after he tries to confront Tran, and gets him to admit that there is a camp, I would say the pacing after that point really slows down. And so we have a lot of footage of Braddock, wandering around the dark side of town, so to speak. And we see like Vietnamese nightlife and everything. And it's a very seedy set of scenes, because there's like there's a brothel, and so there's a lot of naked women there and stuff like that. And plus the set's all grimy and everything, showing this underworld depiction of the underworld, so to speak. And so the character of Tuck was played by Emmet Walsh, who is a really good character actor. But I actually thought that his character, or I thought he was kind of miscast in the movie, because he's clearly older than Chuck Norris here. I don't exactly know what ages they were at this point in time in 1984, but the idea of him, having served with Braddock in Vietnam, I find to be kind of questionable. I mean, unless we're talking like a Troutman Rambo type of working relationship. I mean, that other than that, I just don't think it would make sense that two people of very different ages would be serving together in Vietnam, unless unless Tuck was like, say, a colonel or something along those lines. But I don't think it actually says what Tuck was in Vietnam. It's just you get the idea that the two of them served together in Vietnam. But just the fact that Emmet Walsh is so much older than Chuck Norris, nothing against him as an actor, but just he felt very miscast in the part, So I think that maybe if they'd gotten someone closer to Chuck Norris's age, I feel like that would have been a better, casting choice. And so, for a lot of the movie, past a certain point, we're stuck with, Emmet Walsh as Tuck, and Chuck Norris, traveling, the whole, Vietnamese underworld, and also just, going by boat as well. And so, when the action scenes happen, like they're not bad, but at the same time, there is that aforementioned bit of, I guess you could say, almost musical or Broadway, type of choreography when it comes to the action scenes. Because I mean, the explosions look cool, okay, when they happen, but like when people are shooting, or when people are getting shot at, like the way they fall, it feels like something you'd see in a musical or a stage production. So it is hard to take it seriously when the action looks more theatrical than it does, say, legitimate. So yeah, I just think that the movie had its moments, and Jay Chataway, who did the score, has some good moments as well. But there are some moments where I felt like his score didn't quite work with the scenes, because they felt maybe like the scenes in question had a bit of a score that was a little more upbeat than the scene was calling for, or the scene in question was not an upbeat scene. But then there were moments where there was like an intense build-up as far as the music is concerned. So so Jay Chataway, I mean, he's a good composer, but not exactly his best work. But there are some moments that his score does work. But aside from Chuck Norris, though, there really wasn't anyone that I went away remembering, with the exception of James Hong as General Tran, because, I mean, as I said, James Hong is just a good actor, I mean, he's going to, steal the scene, but, it seems like he's going to be the main villain. But then when, he ends up, getting killed by Chuck Norris, it's kind of like, well, now we're out of charismatic villains, because there is one other villain that sort of takes his spot, but no disrespect to the actor playing him, is just that when you have a guy who's C or D list at best, filling the shoes for James Hong, I mean, yeah, you're going to be lacking in terms of, say, memorable villains. So I do wish that General Tran had a larger part, simply because we could have seen James Hong play another good villain, because when he was on screen, he did a good job of playing a villain who was on the surface polite and conversational and everything, but his words were calculated to push Braddock's buttons. And for the brief amount of times that we saw them together, I liked that little dynamic, because you saw some like a bit of a battle of wills. And so I do wish that General Tran had lasted longer, but for the brief amount of time he's on screen, James Hong does a good job. But once he's gone, then basically we're stuck with Chuck Norris doing his one-man army thing. And there are moments where we get some cool shots, like there's that somewhat iconic shot of Chuck Norris coming out of the water with that big machine gun and gunning down a bunch of Vietnamese soldiers and everything. I mean, it's a cool shot. I don't know how well that would work in real life. I don't know if the water would actually be jamming the gun or what, but I mean, it is a cool shot, so I'll give it that. But beyond little bits like that, it's like the first act actually starts off okay. I mean, the film starts off with a good first act, but then after that, it just really slows down, and that bit of that portrayal of Braddock dealing with PTSD kind of goes out the window, unfortunately. So I'm going to go ahead and give Missing in Action 2 out of 5 stars. It was okay. It could have been much better, especially if the first act was anything to go by. But just unfortunately, the pacing really slows things down past a certain point, and also the choreography and the action scenes really detracted from things as well. And so just the lack of memorable characters also didn't exactly do the movie any favors. But I will give it points for Chuck Norris actually making an effort, so especially in that first act. So Missing in Action 1, I'll give it 2 out of 5 stars. So in regards to the second movie, this one, a lot of people tend to like the first one better than the second one, and I will say that probably as a movie, this, I can understand why, because the first one is basically Chuck Norris doing his one-man army thing, and that's what people went to the theaters to see and what have you. But in the second one, you do get to that point, but it's not until the third act. But there's actually a lot of psychological warfare going on, courtesy of the character of Colonel Yin, as played by Soon-Tek, who, I know I've seen him in some stuff, but the guy was really good in the part. I mean, imagine, say someone like, James Hong's General Tran, but if he was in the whole movie. So, you have, the type of villain who's able to be conversational and surface level polite, but is pushing your buttons the whole step of the way. And here, Colonel Yin is in full control, okay, because he's running the prison camp. And, he just nails the part. And, he does a wonderful job of playing a villain that you really come to despise. And so, definitely, hats off to him in that regard. And so, that's an area where I definitely feel like Missing in Action 2, while it's not objectively a good movie, it's definitely, a better, it's an element of the movie that is better than the first one, in the sense that we actually have a memorable villain who's in the majority of the movie. So, and we also get Chuck Norris, while once more, not exactly delivering award-winning acting, he actually does deliver a, decent, and I want to say there are moments where a borderline good performance does come out. Now, granted, those are just, flashes in the pan, but for the most part, though, his performance, for the material is actually not bad. And once again, I mean, he's not going to be given an Academy Award or anything like that, but he does have a certain amount of range, that's on hand in this film, that was only touched on in the first one, I think. And I feel like, here he did a really good job of, playing Braddock, and you initially see him as, a semi-idealistic guy, at least, before, his helicopter is shot down and he's taken prisoner. But, I mean, he's clearly someone who cares about his men. And, the fact that they've been, in the prison camp for 10 years and, Yin hasn't broken him. I mean, he's able to sell the idea that, Braddock is just that strong of an individual, just, mentally speaking, because there are moments where you could tell that he wants to break, but then, he sort of pulls it together and metaphorically spits in Yin's face. And like, there's a point where, Yin, tells him that, I forgot to tell you, your wife, is considering remarrying, and basically, hitting him with, the equivalent of a Dear John letter. And you can tell it hurts, Braddock, but he basically pulls it together and, tells Yin that if my wife wants to remarry, I'm happy for her, because, I'm not confessing to these bullshit charges, just to, get home and, and shake up her life again, and because if she's waited for me that long, but she wants to move on, I'm happy for her, but you could tell it hurts him though. So, but there's also moments where, like, his character is put in real peril. Like, there's this one memorable bit where he's held upside down and they put a rat in the bag, a rat that they've really pissed off by poking and prodding, and they put the rat in the bag and put it over Braddock's head. And apparently this was actually a real rat, except it was one that was dead. But, Chuck Norris actually insisted that they put a dead rat in there, and, he'd do the rest, and so, but you see what ends up happening is, you hear the rat, squealing and everything, and you hear, Braddock, sort of, muffled screaming as well. But then you see, this blood just start to, pour out of the bag, or pour through the bag. And it's a pretty horrifying moment, because that, something nasty has happened. And then they take the hood off, and you see, and mind you, they're holding him upside down, but you see Braddock with the rat just, clasped in his teeth, just crunched. And that's where all the blood was coming from. I was like, damn. So, I mean, the fact that they put his character through that much torture, and the fact that they actually had a real rat, albeit a dead one, for the scene, definitely lends the movie some, badass points, at least in my opinion. The fact that they were actually, putting, Chuck Norris through a situation like that, and he went along with it. So I definitely like how you see Braddock. I mean, he's definitely a strong-willed individual, but he's not superhuman. Like, he's clearly capable, of being hurt, or he's vulnerable to heat exhaustion and things like that. And there is that moment where the aforementioned squad member who is sick with malaria is given an overdose of opium. And it's just like another form of torture from Colonel Yin. I mean, basically he doesn't hold up his end of the bargain. He after he gets what he wants from Braddock, this confession, he just basically sentences this sick guy to death by way of an overdose, and then burns him alive. And like, they set him out on this this I guess like this little bench, and lay him down, and they pour gasoline on the guy, and the guy's clearly dying, but he's not dead yet. Like, he's moaning and stuff, and whispering no, and things like that. And Braddock, he's in this other hut, being, forced to watch all this, and he's screaming for Yin, to stop, and he's saying he's not dead, and he just, you see him break down, like he's, forced to watch all this. And the way Chuck Norris plays it, it was a lot better acting than I thought the guy was capable of, if I'm being honest. And he has this really haunted look on his face, and you just believe it. You believe the scene, or you believe, that he's finally reached his breaking point. And apparently, the main reason that he was so effective in that scene was because if you look on IMDb and stuff like that, they talk about how he asked the people for them to just do one take, because he said that he was gonna in order to get to the emotional point that he had to for the character in that moment, he was going to be thinking about something that was really upsetting to him, and namely, he was going to be thinking about his younger brother who got killed in Vietnam. And he said that he knew it was going to shake him up, and he did not want to go through it again. And so he said, though, that he was going to do it, but it would just be for one take, and he pulled it off. And say what you will about the actual movie, whether you like the movie or not, but that moment, though, that was a pretty powerful moment. So also, another actor that does a good job is the actor Stephen Williams, who I mainly remember him as Mr. X from the X-Files. And that was the first time I saw him in anything, but good actor. But he's also a good actor here. He plays a guy named Captain Nestor, and he was one of Braddock's squad mates in the helicopter that had been shot down. But he unfortunately gave in to Yin and admitted to his war crimes, and so he's still being held prisoner. But Yin's making a point to treat him better than, say, the rest of the POWs, and making sure that all the other POWs see it. And so Stephen Williams, though, you don't outright hate his character for this. It's like, considering the type of torture that they're all going through, you're kind of like, well, I mean, I know Braddock was capable of, holding up through it all, but at the same time, not everyone else is Braddock. I mean, everyone else has a different breaking point. And the fact that you get the idea that Nestor held out for a long time before he ended up giving in. And so it doesn't exactly, put him in good standing with his, fellow POWs, but at the same time, with something in the way of, having seen a bit more in real life and everything, I couldn't bring myself to, hate the guy or anything like that. It's like, I understood why the rest of his fellow prisoners didn't like him, but I also understand why he ended up giving in. So, so a very actually a better performance than I thought I would find in this kind of movie, for a character like that. And so there are moments where you definitely feel sorry for Nestor, but then there are moments where you're like, dude, stop licking Yin's boots, and so it's that bit of a dichotomy there. It's like I couldn't bring myself to hate the guy, but I was also kind of hoping that he would have some kind of sense slapped into him, to where it's like, I mean, I understood why he broke, but I also was kind of like, dude, Yin's just gonna kill you, once you served your purpose, and even though Yin is so dead set on breaking Braddock, that he's willing to keep the prisoners alive to witness this, and he's keeping Nestor around to serve it as an example of, see, you'll be treated better if you give in, but he's also utilizing Nestor in his schemes to break Braddock down. Like, there's a point where he forces the two of them to fight each other, and Nestor makes it very clear that he doesn't want to do this, but Yin forces him to. And so he's just telling Braddock, he's like, he goes back and forth between saying, look, just take a few hits and go down, man, because he doesn't want to hurt him. But at the same time, though, he's not wanting Braddock to just go down in one punch. I mean, he's like, you're a soldier, come on, fight. And then sure enough, I mean, even though he's suffering from heat and a broken down body and everything, Braddock does end up putting up a fight. And so but yeah, I mean, Stephen Williams, though, he was good in the part, and I thought that he definitely distinguished himself. But unfortunately, regarding everyone else, I mean, with the exceptions of Soon-Tek as Colonel Yin and Stephen Williams as Nestor, and of course Chuck Norris as Braddock, the other actors I honestly didn't think did a good job. I mean, I felt like it kind of like what the movie had the problem of the action scenes feeling like something from a musical stage production in terms of the choreography. I felt like the acting for the rest of the POWs and say like the rest of the bad guys felt like something you would see in a stage production or a musical or something like that, because it felt over the top at times, or if not over the top, then at least underdeveloped. But so there are moments where it's like certain characters go through some very brutal torture scenes, but because of how they're playing their parts and how over the top they're playing their parts, and how in terms of theatricality, I felt it was difficult to take their plight seriously, versus say, Chuck Norris actually putting forth a solid effort in the film to basically sell the turmoil that he's going through, and then Stephen Williams, doing the good job that he does. It's like everyone else, I just, I had a hard time, pulling for or getting attached to. And I think another problem in that regard is, the score of the movie by Brian May, not the guitarist from Queen, but the guy who did the score for Mad Max. And, that's a problem I had with the Mad Max movie, is that it's a good movie, but Brian May's score at times feels very, over the top and bombastic in certain scenes, like scenes that are supposed to be very serious and emotional. But then you have a bombastic and serious score, like sounding like something you'd hear on, the old Star Trek TV show. I mean, it really clashes with what's supposed to be, serious material, at least in my opinion. And that's where, we have actors who are over the top in terms of their theatricality for certain scenes, and then you have a score that's over the top in terms of how theatrical it sounds and bombastic that it sounds in certain scenes, where we're supposed to be, feeling sorry for these guys, that kind of thing. So that's where, I feel like the movie kind of gets dragged down. And, but on the other hand, though, when it gets into the third act, when, Braddock finally, says enough of this shit and cuts loose, that's where we get some badass Chuck Norris action scenes, in terms of, say, he goes all one-man army, on these guys who've been holding him and his, fellow POWs, and, and he has some, good pyrotechnic effects and everything, because, I mean, you get, on one hand, on there's a bit where, he, utilizes a flamethrower, to good effect, and as well as multiple explosives. And so, on one hand, I guess you could say that, it's, hard to take seriously, if you're, trying to, consider the notion that Braddock is a guy who's malnourished and, he's been physically and psychologically tortured, and he's doing as good of a job as he is, killing all these people. But on the other hand, though, considering that Chuck Norris did a good enough job in playing the part, and plus the fact that, we want these guys to die, as in, the Vietnamese, soldiers who were torturing them and all that, especially Colonel Yin, we want Braddock to succeed in that regard. And plus, there's a really cool, final, showdown between him and Yin, and the two of them, have, a martial arts fight. And that's where you're like, okay, Chuck Norris, is definitely a good martial arts fighter, and Soon-Tek actually does a pretty good job in the fight scene as well. So it's like, Chuck Norris is going to win in the fight, but Yin puts up a good enough fight where it's like, okay, it's not just a walk in the park, for Braddock. Like, he actually has to work for it, even though he's going to come out on top. So, yeah, I think that there are moments where, at least for me, a borderline good movie is trying to come out, because there are some very well done moments in this scene. But unfortunately, when you have the majority of the cast, honestly not being that good, with the exceptions of, Chuck Norris, Stephen Williams, and Soon-Tek, I mean, and you're stuck with the supporting players for a good amount of the time, that tends to drag the movie down, and and you really feel like the pacing's being thrown off. And also, of course, when you have the majority of the score being a very bombastic one, and when what's supposed to be like a very, serious, piece of subject matter, that's another thing that brings the movie down as well. So. And also, of course, there's the confusion of how, like, the timelines, clash, between movies. And someone else pointed out the fact that, if Missing in Action 2 was supposed to be showing, exactly what Braddock went through and everything, then Missing in Action 1, probably didn't even need to happen, because Braddock and whatever survivors there were that made it out of the camp at the end, would have been proof enough that, the Vietnamese were holding, POWs long past the Vietnam War's expiration date, So that's another, problem where, because of how the timelines clash, the logic of the movies doesn't make a whole lot of sense, at least if you're trying to put them together logically. It's like, anytime you deal with fiction, you have to shut your brain off to some degree. But, when you have the timelines clashing like that, and, this movie's supposed to be, showing exactly, what happened with Braddock prior to the first movie, and narratively speaking, I mean, it presents some problems, that's another thing that works against the movie. So, I want to give, Missing in Action 2, 3 out of 5 stars. And there are moments where it really comes close to being a decent movie. But unfortunately, because of, the less than stellar, supporting players, or I should say the majority of the supporting players, as well as the misplaced musical score, as well as the confusing timelines, I can't quite say it's a decent movie, but I'm going to say it's somewhere between a 2 and a 3 for me. Probably more like 2.5 out of 5. So, while there are things I like about the first movie, unfortunately, it's not that good of a movie in my opinion. But I do like the second one better than the first one. But still, it's while it is better than the first one, at least in my opinion, in the sense that Chuck Norris, we actually get to see him, grappling with psychological warfare and everything, and giving a better performance than expected. And plus, you have a very memorable villain. I think that the movie's better in that regard. So, Missing in Action 2, I'm going to go ahead and give it 2.5 out of 5 stars. So, Missing in Action 1, 2 stars. Missing in Action 2, 2.5 out of 5. So, but yeah, that was my take on both movies, and I hope you enjoyed this review. And if you made it this far, thank you very much. And if you like what you see here, feel free to like and subscribe. And if you got any questions, comments, please drop a line and let me know. So, hope you all have a good evening. Y'all take care. Bye.